Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we look at theories of everything, ancient and modern, try to look at them from all perspectives and figure out how to use these things in our own life to help us with our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, and our formation of a holistic worldview. Today is our 550th video that we've done on the reciprocal system of theory. I would challenge you to find anybody who's even done 5 videos on the reciprocal system of theory. But the reciprocal system is a theory of everything that was originally derived by Dewey B. Larson. In the 20th century, in about 1959, he proposed his 2 fundamental postulates about how he believed the universe operated. He's one of the few scientists to propose a universe based not on matter, not on energy, but on motion. The universe is made out of motion. And in Larson's universe, motion was defined as the relationship between space and time. That is a reciprocal relationship. All of our scientific quantities are forms of motion. Matter is a kind of motion. Energy is a kind of motion. Pressure is a kind of motion. Force is a kind of motion. And they all can be expressed in fractions, with space or time as the numerator and time or space as the denominator. Space and time can have multiple dimensions. You can have time in the 2nd power, the 3rd power, I guess all the way up to the 6th power. Larson's first fundamental postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. From there, Larson derived, plugging that into really his 2nd postulate, that the universe conforms to the relations of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its primary magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. Plugging those in, Larson was able to arrive at a theoretical universe about how he believed the universe operated. And then from there, he compared his theoretical universe with the empirical, measured universe of modern science that they compile in their scientific tables, their astronomical tables. He has books on chemistry and physics and astronomy, reflecting those comparisons. He also has a book on metaphysics that includes subjects such as biology, philosophy, religion, psychology. And he has 2 books on economics. And we're looking at one of those 2 books today called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. It is primarily on macroeconomics. And we are in chapter 13 of that book called Cost Inflation. And Larson takes the economists to task on their sociological approach to economics. Larson contends that economics, like everything else, is a science, and that your economic system has to be constructed based on scientific principles, in the same way that a house that you build has to be based on the principles of physics and gravity and, force and compression and, things that you would consider if you were an architect or, a builder. And if you don't do that, then your building will collapse, just like your economic system will collapse. And so Larson strips away all of those ideas about sociological economics and plugs in his ideas having to do with the first principles. He first envisions the Robinson Crusoe economy and gradually introduces barter, money, and then employees, and arrives at a modern economic system, which in many cases he compares to a gasoline engine. The engine is running, but then you also have the cooling system of the engine that is kind of like money, and contends that there are very simple ways to regulate the economic system for a condition of permanent prosperity. He'll get into that here as we move through these chapters. If you'd like to get back to the beginning of this book, you want to go back about a month in the archives and start with chapter 1. If you'd like to get a more detailed explanation of the reciprocal system itself, watch one of my first 474 videos on this subject, where I go a little bit more detailed on that. For today, I'm going to just assume that you have some kind of understanding of the reciprocal system, or that you just are okay with, going it on the fly. And we're going to take over in chapter 13, maybe a third of the way through. The situation with respect to maintaining a stable market price level is quite different. Heretofore, it has been quite generally assumed that economic equilibrium and stability of the price level are one and the same thing. But this analysis shows that stability is attained when market price conforms to whatever price changes occur at the production end of the mechanism, so that market price and production price are always equal. Under conditions such as those which have existed in recent years, where the wage cost per unit of production is continually rising, that is, cost inflation is taking place, the market price level will also continue to rise, even if the business cycle is eliminated. In other words, stabilization of the money purchasing power flow eliminates money inflation, the kind of inflation originating in the goods markets, but it does not eliminate cost inflation, the kind of inflation originating in the production market. If it is desired to eliminate cost inflation as well as money inflation, and thus establish a stable price level in addition to a balanced flow of money purchasing power, it will be necessary to take some definite and systematic action to prevent wages from rising any faster than general productivity. Here we arrive at a question of public policy which is outside the field of economic science. Unlike money inflation, which works to the detriment of the majority in the long run and has few friends, cost inflation due to wage increases takes from some for the benefit of others, and therefore has powerful support from those who are benefited, particularly labor union members and those who are in a position to keep pace with the union wage increases. Supervisory employees in the high wage industries, for example. Ironically, the high wage policy also receives much support from the very individuals who are its chief victims. The unorganized worker generally feels that if union members receive a pay increase, he will ultimately get one too, not realizing that when and if this increase materializes, it will do no more than make up for the price rise due to the previous union wage increases, and will merely put him back in the same relative position that he occupied to start with. Whereas the favored groups have prospered at his expense in the meantime. Similarly, socially conscious groups, such as the school teachers who, whether or not they are unionized, are inclined to support all efforts that are made to raise the pay of the industrial workers, not realizing that their own low pay scales, about which they complain so bitterly, are not low by any absolute standard, but are relatively low simply because they have been outdistanced by the inflationary processes which the teachers themselves have assiduously, if unintentionally, promoted. The explanation for this absurd situation, in which large economic groups are exerting their best efforts without any conscious altruistic motive to reduce their own economic well-being by extending special favors to other groups, lies in the general acceptance of the totally fallacious idea that wage increases are secured at the expense of the employers. As pointed out earlier, it is conceded by almost all of those who have made a full-scale study of the matter that the average compensation of the suppliers of capital in percent return on the investment is, and of necessity must be, fixed by considerations which operate independently of the price of labor. It therefore follows that, irrespective of what may take place between any individual employer and his employees, the total compensation of the suppliers of capital services depends entirely on the amount of capital employed, and it cannot be altered by wage manipulation. As expressed by Keynes, the struggle about money wages primarily affects the distribution of the aggregate real wage between different labor groups, and not the average amount per unit of employment, which depends on a different set of forces. That's end quote. Wage increases, then, are not secured at the expense of employers as a whole. If the increases are selective, the benefits to the favored workers are secured at the expense of the workers who do not participate in the increase, and the individuals who receive fixed money incomes. If all workers receive comparable increases, there is no benefit to any except what can be gained at the expense of the fixed income recipients, bondholders, pensioners, insurance policyholders, and the like. In any event, this gain is relatively small, as the fixed component of the national income is a minor fraction of the total, and the inflationary impact on the recipients of these fixed incomes is being counteracted by an increasing number of devices such as cost of living, adjustments for pensioners, convertible bonds, inflation clauses in contracts, indexing for inflation, etc. As a first approximation, therefore, the existence of incomes that are fixed in monetary terms can be disregarded in a mathematical examination of the relation between wages and prices. In undertaking such an examination, let us look at the general situation in which the average wage per unit of output is W, the average investment per unit of output is I, and the average cost of the services of capital is X% of the value of the capital utilized. All production costs can be reduced to labor and the services of capital, and the total production costs, the production price, under the circumstances described is therefore W plus X times I. The investment per unit of output in the short-term situation is fixed. And if we denote the ratio of W plus X times I to W, the ratio of W plus X times I to W by the symbol A, we can express the production price per unit of output as AW and the capital cost component as A minus 1 times W. Since the normal market price is equal to the production price, the normal market price is also AW. In discussions of the question as to the effect of higher wages on market prices, the statement is frequently made that even though the wage increase does raise prices, the worker makes a proportional gain at the expense of other elements of production costs, such as taxes and materials, which remain unchanged. But in reality, payments for such items are merely indirect payments for labor and capital services. And since the cost of capital is determined by considerations which are independent of the wage rate, such statements as the foregoing amount to nothing more than assertions that workers who receive wage increases gain at the expense of other workers whose pay is not increased. This is true, of course, but it has no bearing on the question that we are now examining, the question as to the effect of an increase in the average wage rate. It should also be noted that the cost of capital services is fixed in real terms, and changing the money labels by raising wages does not enable making gains at the expense of the suppliers of capital. Returning now to the mathematical development, if wages are increased from W to MW, this causes the normal market price level, the price of goods in general, to increase by a factor which we will call N. Our question then is, what is the relation of M, the increase in wages, to N, the increase in prices? In approaching this question, we note first that the investment I is in the form of capital goods, and because of the increase in the price of goods in general, these capital goods increase in monetary value proportionately, raising the investment to NI. The relation between normal market price and the two components of production price then becomes MW plus the quantity A minus 1 times NW equals ANW. In the short term, where A is constant, this equation reduces to M equals N, which tells us that an increase in wages produces an equivalent increase in prices. And the normal price level at any specific rate of productivity is proportional to the average wage. The level of money wages in the economy as a whole, therefore, has no effect on real wages, the wage in terms of ability to buy goods. In spite of the fact that Keynes arrived at the same result from different premises, this finding will be vigorously resisted, both because most people do not want to believe it, and because, to the superficial observer, and most of us are superficial observers of the things that we have not studied in detail, it seems obvious that the workers who secure a wage increase must have made a gain at the expense of the employer. But this is just another outcropping of that notorious logical error so common in the economic field, failure to recognize that what is true of a part is not necessarily true of the whole. A business enterprise does not operate in a closed compartment of its own. It operates as a part of the general economy, and it operates under very rigid rules, one of which is that in order to survive, it must compensate the suppliers of capital services in amounts that are commensurate with the value of the services of wealth, as defined earlier. Income cannot be diverted from suppliers of capital services to workers in any more than a very limited and temporary way without coming in conflict with this rule. The average business enterprise cannot absorb the added cost of a wage increase by taking a smaller profit, even if the company's executives would prefer to do so. It must compensate for the loss in net revenue in some manner. Otherwise, the necessary inflow of new capital dries up and the business soon ceases to exist. When the wage settlement is industry-wide, an immediate price rise is even more certain. A good demonstration of this was provided some years ago when the federal government attempted to prevent a wage increase in the steel industry from being followed by a price increase. The steel industry's announcement of an immediate increase was furiously assailed by every means, legal and extra-legal, available to the administration, and the industry was forced to withdraw the higher prices. Yet only a few months later, the same administration bowed to the inevitable and meekly acquiesced in an increase dressed up in a slightly different form. The attempt to prevent the increase was not only futile, it was doubly futile, inasmuch as all that would have been accomplished, had it been successful, would have been to increase the price of something else, rather than the prices of steel and steel products. Some price must rise when money purchasing power is arbitrarily increased. Even though it is not within the province of economic science to arrive at a decision on a question such as that of whether some control should be exercised over wage rates, it is definitely appropriate for a scientific work to point out the facts upon which such a decision should be based. This is all the more desirable when the facts, such as those that have been discussed, are so generally unknown or deliberately ignored. A point that should be taken into consideration in this connection is that some of the economic developments of recent years have resulted in a significant change in the impact of cost inflation. In earlier eras, there was a tendency to look upon the effect of such inflation with equanimity, on the assumption that the principal losses were suffered by the recipients of fixed incomes, and these individuals, being members of the wealthier classes, could presumably absorb the losses without too much hardship. The great increase in life insurance in the past few decades, the rapid growth of pension programs, and the widespread sale of government bonds in small denominations have completely changed this picture. Today, a large proportion of those who are the principal victims of inflation of any kind are in the middle and lower income brackets. In this connection, it should be noted that while the amount of gain to the workers at the expense of the fixed income recipients is quite small in proportion to the extremely large total of wages and earnings on equity capital, this amount is a very important item when applied against the much smaller total of fixed income. It should also be realized that the improvements in productivity which take place in any particular industry, the automobile industry, for example, are not exclusively due to increased efficiency on the part of the labor and management in this industry. On the contrary, they are primarily, sometimes entirely, attributable to events that have occurred elsewhere. Improvements in the tools and equipment that are supplied to this industry by thousands of other producers, more efficient production on the part of other thousands of producers who supply the industry with materials of one kind or another, perhaps discoveries made in our university laboratories, certainly the efforts of the teachers who have educated the individuals that are responsible for the improvements, and so on, almost without end. The annual increase in productivity that we regularly experience is the result of continued interrelated efforts on the part of all segments of the economy. It is rather generally believed that the process of bargaining between employer and employees in any enterprise or industry is a matter of arranging an equitable division of the products of their joint efforts. And the current system of wage negotiation in the United States is based on this premise. If the employees and stockholders of each enterprise consumed their own products, this belief would have considerable justification. But the participants in the modern business enterprise do not divide their own products. They divide the buying power, that is, the values of those products. And those values are not inherent in the products. They are mainly created by the community as a whole, not by those who supply labor and capital in the individual enterprises. Here is one of the reasons why it was necessary to go into so much detail in discussing the basic elements and concepts of economics in the preceding chapters. The nature of economic value is by no means self-evident. Without taking the time to analyze a subject, one can hardly be expected to realize, for instance, that the value of non-necessities is determined almost entirely by the productive efficiency of those who produce the necessities. Yet it is easy to see that this is true. If Mozart or Schubert were alive today, their compositions would be worth millions instead of the trivial sums that these composers actually received, not because their inherent merit would be any different, or because today's public has any greater appreciation of musical masterpieces, but simply because the producers of the necessities of life have increased their productivity to such a degree that high values can be placed on non-necessities. The values of necessities are more directly related to the productive efficiency than those of non-essentials. But this gives no more support to the idea that the workers and their employers are dividing up what they produce, as the relation is inverse. That is, the less efficient a basic industry is, the greater the market value of its product. Many, perhaps most, readers will take exception to this statement because of the prevailing opinion that the profitability of an industry depends on its productive efficiency. But there are two things wrong with this general opinion. First, it is not true. Second, it is not relevant to the point at issue. The profitability of the individual enterprise depends on its relative productivity as compared to that of its competitors. But the general level of profitability in the industry as a whole is dependent on a large number of factors not related to efficiency. And in any event, wages are not paid out of profits. They are paid out of income. The income of an industry for a given volume of production depends on the market price, which in turn is determined by the cost of production. Inefficient production raises the cost, which raises the selling price, which raises the total producer income. The demand for the products of these basic industries is relatively inelastic. Consequently, any increase in costs, such as that due to an increase in the wage rate, can be, and promptly is, matched by a corresponding increase in market price, which brings back to the producer the amount of money that is required in order to pay the higher wage. What this means is that the wages are not adjusted to the income of the industry in accordance with the assumption on which the prevailing method of establishing wage rates is based. The income is automatically adjusted to the wage negotiation. The income is automatically adjusted to the wage settlements. Thus, the participants in a wage negotiation are not arriving at a decision as to how they are going to divide the products of their efforts. They are being permitted to decide how much they are going to draw out of the general production of the community. These comments apply to all agreements between employers and employees on rates of pay, irrespective of the type of work involved or the basis of payment, not merely those arrived at by means of the bargaining procedure. In the light of the foregoing facts, together with the points previously brought out concerning the impact of the inflationary burdens, it seems apparent that the nation should at least begin giving some consideration to methods of controlling wages and salaries, not only to prevent them from rising faster than productivity and thus inflating the price level, but also to ensure that all those who work for a living participate in whatever increases may be appropriate, rather than allowing the benefits of the increased production toward which all have contributed to fall mainly in the hands of certain favored groups. Obviously, however, this is a highly controversial subject, and it has therefore seemed advisable to limit our consideration of practical inflation control measures in the later chapters to the elimination of money inflation only, leaving this more sensitive subject of cost inflation for treatment elsewhere. The question of wage and salary controls will, however, receive further attention in connection with other aspects of the economy that are affected by a lack of balance in the wage structure. Okay, I believe that we will stop there for today, and I believe we will be able to finish this chapter tomorrow when we resume. So thanks for tuning in today, and hope you come back and catch the end here. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great day.